Hi, welcome to my video that will discuss the flooding that occurred in the middle of December 2025 in Washington State. This is what the mid-level water vapor looked like on December 9th for that event. What I'm going to discuss is what was predicted to happen and what actually happened. There were some high flows with significant impacts, so I'm going to try to put these in perspective, as well as try to address some of the questions that comes from these events, such as why did the levees fail days after the rain stopped? Why were there evacuations, and how does this relate to what we've seen in the past? I will also include websites that either provide more background or links to where one can find the data that shows what I'm talking about so one can get a deeper understanding of these subjects. These sites will be shown both on the slides and in the first comment below the video. One of the challenges in understanding what level of flood event we might see is understanding how much water is coming in from these atmospheric rivers as seen on this slide, and then how that water may fall out when it hits the shore, as well as the orographic features such as the Olympic and Cascade Mountains. The experts that determine how much rain is to fall and where, and then how that rainfall will affect river flows, is the National Weather Service and their associated river forecast centers. Because this event hit the Pacific Northwest, the data is coming from the Northwest River Forecast Center. This site is where one can see what is predicted over the next 10 days at each gauge that they have a prediction set up for, represented by the circles on the map. One of the first data sets to understand how these forecasts are made is what rainfall is predicted over the coming days. I usually do this by going to this website and downloading the KML file to view in Google Earth. This is the one I downloaded on the evening of December 8th that shows the predicted precipitation over the next 72 hours. I put a black circle around the bright yellow spot because when one hovers on that spot, one can see that the prediction is for 15 inches, whereas the darker yellow and orange is around 10 inches. That prediction location is in the Puyallup River Basin, and I will talk about that in more detail in a minute. To put floods in context, we often look at how likely they are to occur, as that is the standard that many things get built to in and around rivers, such as bridges, culverts, levees, and dams. So I will do that translation to terms such as flood that has a 1% chance of exceeding in a given year, or also called a 100-year flood, which also there's a 10% chance, which is related to a 10-year flood, or a 0.2% chance, which relates to a 500-year flood. A big focus when flood events occur is often on the 1% chance, or the 100-year flood, as that is a standard that communities are required to build safely to for them to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So when a flood reaches that level or greater, that is when damages are more likely to occur in a community. So there's a tool that was built while I was at FEMA, done with a variety of federal and state partners that help bring in the flood forecasts and translate them into flood frequency, which is shown as the tax on this map. Gauges that most represented the Huck 8 watershed were also then projected to that same color for the watershed. The color coding is in the top left corner, where white is less than a 2-year event, to a red color representing a 100 to 500-year event. When one does this for the forecast that was put out on December 7th by the Northwest River Forecast Center, one can see that the rare events are centered around the Puyallup River Basin. If you recall from the precipitation forecast from the event, there was a peak rainfall of 15 inches predicted for the 72 hours coming up, and that was reflected in the gauge forecasts themselves that show the Puyallup near Ording projected to see a 200-year event, and the Carbon River is also in a similar area and was predicted to be close to a 20-year event. Both of these drain through Ording, and there are no dams on this part of the Puyallup, so these flows make it down to the Puyallup-Fife-Tacoma area. The concern there is that the levees have around a 50,000 cubic feet per second capacity before they could potentially overtop and or possibly fail. So the prediction of the Puyallup River at Puyallup to get to 48,400 was likely to have raised some concerns. Just to highlight how this basin looks, the yellow pin is where the Puyallup River at Puyallup gauge is, and that is where all the levees, where there are levees all the way down to the mouth of the Tacoma. The light green highlights where all the runoff is coming from to that point, so one can see these flows originate off the north and west parts of Mount Rainier. It is important to note that the flows that come from the White River part of the Puyallup River, shown here in purple, can be controlled somewhat by Mud Mountain Dam, which by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for flood control. This is an aerial view of the dam from Google Earth, and the dam can be closed off for a certain amount of time to reduce the flows that are seen downstream. This operation is designed to provide the best benefit to the areas of Puyallup downstream to Tacoma, as that is what it was originally designed for. I want to highlight the erosion scarp upstream of the dam in the red rectangle, as that will be shown in the next slide for perspective. The art in providing the most protection by a dam to those downstream is to time the filling of the dam so the minimum release can be seen downstream of the dam when the rest of the basin is peaking. For perspective, on the right is what the upstream area looks like most of the time, and on the left is what it looked like in November 2006 when there was a large event that needed to be controlled. The red rectangles are that erosion scarp I showed earlier. If this pool fills up too soon, then everything that enters the pool has to exit, much like a bathtub. So one does not want to fill too early, and one needs to find ways to release flows when one can. If there are back-to-back flood events, so there's still space to store for the second event. This is what that release looked like from the dam in November 2006 of 12,000 cubic feet per second. The peak release for the December 2025 event looked more like 10,000 cubic feet per second from the gauge. Both of these flows are significantly below the inflows that were seen at the peak of the event and were released after the flows from the controlled part of the basin had receded downstream. So getting back to the map, I'm now adding the stream gauges so you can see where the Puyallup River near Ording gauge is, and then also where the Carbon River near Fairfax is, both on the side of the basin that is not controlled by the dam. This is a map of what the floodplain would look like if the levees failed on the Puyallup River from Puyallup downstream to the mouth. This did not happen for this event, but this is what the dam is looking to prevent by controlling these flows downstream. But there were structures that failed both on the White River below Mud Mountain Dam near the town of Pacific, and also on another river nearby that has a dam that controls flows upstream on the Green River with a levee failure in the Tukwila area. I didn't capture the inflow gauges to the dam, so I'm going to project a bit from a gauge upstream of Mud Mountain Dam that peaked 3 times over 3 days between 3,000 and 4,000 CFS. The dates are shown on the x-axis and the flows in cubic feet per second are on the y-axis. This gauge only captures 20% of the drainage area that flows into Mud Mountain Dam, but one can see that the flows stayed up for several days, which means a lot of volume of water was entering into the dam. When one looks at keeping the flows below 50,000 cubic feet per second at Puyallup, that goal was met, as you can see from the gauge data that showed that the peak was kept to 44,000 cubic feet per second at the highest, when it likely could have been at least 60,000 cubic feet per second if the dam did not control the flows. I was not working on this event in any way, so I'm just providing perspective on what these levees were seeing and should not be taken as an exact analysis of what happened. The first gauge above is just below the dam, and the second gauge is around where the HESCO bales gave way on the White River. These protection structures were added after the 2009 flood due to vulnerabilities seen on the White River, where the channel was a grading and therefore needed more protection to keep areas like Pacific protected from the river. I don't know the details of the design, but it likely was similar to the authorized release from the dam of 12,000 cubic feet per second when one looks at the releases. I believe, though, that this would be the first time these protection structures were tested for as long as they were on this event. The red line represents the local community flood stage, and the flows stayed right around that level for 12 days, with the HESCO bales giving way on December 16th, 7 days in. For the Green River, Howard Hansen Dam is designed to control flows to 12,000 cubic feet per second at Auburn on the Green River. This dam also likely saw 20 to 30,000 cubic feet per second as an inflow to the dam, and one can see it controlled those flows to 12,000 CFS, with the top graph showing the flows released from the dam, and the bottom graph is showing the flows at the Auburn gauge that they regulate to. The red line represents the flood stage for the communities. All of the levees in the system are designed to at least 12,000 cubic feet per second plus some level of freeboard, but this is another situation where the flows stayed high on the levees for roughly 10 days, which puts a lot of pressure on the levees. The levee near Tukwila failed on December 15th, 6 days in. There's likely a lot more to the story about these levees, but I just wanted to provide that perspective on why these situations can occur days after the initial rainfall may have stopped. So I showed earlier what the forecast was on December 7th using the raft tool to convert it to flood frequency. One can also use that tool to determine the frequencies for observed events as well. So this was the result for the peaks observed for the first atmospheric river event, and one can see that the Puyallup River did see some of those flows, but it also hit the watersheds just south with events from a 10-year to a 50-year in spots. This is a list of what was observed at these gauges with the flood frequencies in the second to last column. But this was just round one. There was a second atmospheric river coming in, and the forecast on December 10th for the next couple days was a significant increase, particularly from Seattle northward. In looking at the gauge by gauge analysis for this forecast, one can see there are some pretty high flows predicted for the Skagit, Snoqualmie, and Cedar rivers, as well as others. I want to particularly focus on the Skagit River near concrete prediction of 206,000 cubic feet per second. With that forecast came a series of evacuation notices, so I wanted to try to provide some perspective on what can get something to that level and why these should be taken seriously. I'm going to focus on the Skagit, as that is probably the easiest to show the risks that an event like the one predicted poses for the community. This basin has similarities to the Puyallup in that it has dams that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers controls in large flood events based on agreements with the Seattle City Light with Ross Dam and Puget Sound Energy with Upper Baker Dam. But the drainage above these two dams only represents 40% of the drainage area for the basin. The levees at the downstream end from Sedro-Woolley to the mouths are mostly designed to roughly 160,000 cubic feet per second, except for possibly the Mount Vernon flood wall that may be greater than that. But there are communities upstream of this that are far more vulnerable. One of these communities is Hamilton. This is what this town looked like in 2003 when the flows got to 166,000 cubic feet per second. Keep in mind the prediction here is for 206,000 cubic feet per second. This flood line from the 2003 event shows the depth at this location for 166,000 cubic feet per second. Cape Horn has similar challenges. This is just upstream of here. This type of flooding makes evacuation necessary. The larger populations at risk from a flow prediction that exceeds the levee capacity are those downstream of Sedro-Woolley. All of these black marks along the river represent past levee failures that then release a lot of water into the overbank. For perspective, the levees likely have a capacity that they can hold roughly 160,000 cubic feet per second. But if the levees fail, the channel itself can only carry roughly 90,000 cubic feet per second. So that means that roughly 70,000 cubic feet per second heads over bank when a levee fails. For perspective, a basketball has a 1 foot diameter, so if it came in a square box, that would be 1 cubic foot. If a levee fails at 160,000 cubic feet per second, then 70,000 basketballs per second head over bank, and if the water hits an obstruction, it accumulates to 4.2 million basketballs in a minute and 250 million basketballs in an hour. That is a lot of water. Because of this vulnerability, the risk has been analyzed in detail. This map shows the different scenarios that were looked at if the levees failed in different locations in the past. In going through each of these scenarios, this is the one that heads north to Samish Bay through the city of Burlington, over I-5 and down towards La Conner and Padilla Bay. So it's considered the right bank levee on the Skagit River as you look downstream. In looking at the results of this, one can see the flooding is significant and then ponds up as it hits the sea dikes at the downstream ends. There's also historic events where we understand how deep the water may get in places, much thanks to a local flood historian, Larry Kunstler. I'm providing the link to his website here in the chat. There are some interpretations on the site that I don't agree with, but there isn't a better source for historical understanding of the Skagit. So for Burlington, historical failures show the flooding could get to 3 to 8 feet from historical news articles quoted here. I-5 runs through this area as well and would be overtopped significantly in such a scenario. Out to Samish Bay could see up to 6 or 7 feet of flooding due to constrictions by the sea dikes, and Padilla Bay is even worse. The next scenario is looking at the left bank as one looks downstream. From the modeling, one can see a failure can lead to 10 to 20 feet of water depth in a number of areas. So for North Mount Vernon, that is one of the more challenging spots for a levee failure, as it is bounded by levees and high ground quickly, so it fills up quickly to 10 to 15 feet of depth. When the levees failed south of Mount Vernon in 1951, this is what it looked like. Conway is towards the top of the picture, and I-5 now runs through this valley and would likely be shut down for weeks in this type of situation. The last failure run I will mention is for Fur Island. That is situated between the north and south forks of the Skagit River as it splits below Mount Vernon. There are sea dikes at the downstream end to prevent coastal flooding, so when a levee fails, the area above the sea dikes fills to the top of the sea dikes in this scenario. This happened in 1990, and the depths seen were close to 10 feet in a number of spots. So I highlight all of this to show you that when a forecast comes in that high, which was 206,000 cubic feet per second, the risk is very real. And when one sees these types of depths, possibly through the basin, evacuations are a crucial tool for protecting life safety. I have shown you the flood peaks, flood frequency predicted on December 7th, and then what was observed by December 10th, and then the updated forecast going forward on December 10th. This map shows the observed peaks that were actually observed by December 13th, with most peaks occurring on December 10th and December 11th. One can see the bullseye of 100-year events in the Snoqualmie and Skykomish basins, with it bleeding over to the east side to the Wenatchee and Stehekin basins. When one looks at the analysis at individual stream gauges, one can see that 12 gauges saw 100-year flows or higher. Some of these are on upstream gauges that have smaller populations, so I'm going to focus on some key gauges. We've already discussed the Puyallup, and that came in close to the forecast, but the flows at Puyallup were kept to a maximum of 44,000 cubic feet per second. You can see that the Skagit River near Concrete came well below 206,000 cubic feet per second forecast and ended up peaking at 152,000 cubic feet per second. This could be deduced a bit ahead of time, as the peaks predicted for both the upstream gauges for the Skagit River near Marble Mount and Sauk River at Sauk were both running under by 20,000 cubic feet per second at their peak. The river peaks at Concrete 15 hours before it gets to Mount Vernon, where the levees are. This lower flow likely spared most of the areas downstream protected by levees, but it still likely highly impacted the towns of Hamilton and Cape Horn. I want to also highlight the peak flows on the Snoqualmie River and Skykomish River that both flow into the Snohomish River, as well as the Middle Fork Nooksack River near Deming, as they saw some significant flows. The last chart I showed you was one that showed the flood frequency, but another way to look at these floods is to compare them to the floods of record we have seen on these basins. So that is what this chart is showing. So for example, the Snoqualmie River near Carnation, the peak flow observed for this event was 89,700 CFS, which is the highest event recorded in the 84-year gauge record. It is actually a 95-year record, but I haven't added the last 11 years to my table calculations. The previous high was in 2009 with a peak of 82,900 CFS. The Cedar River at Renton was the highest in 79 years. The Skykomish was the second highest in 96 years. So in 2006, it got a half foot higher on that particular gauge. For perspective, this is what the city of Sultan looked like in the 2006 flood event on the Skykomish River. And this is what the Skykomish River looked like upstream near Index in 2006. As you can see, these large flood events don't always match the flat water surface profile floodplain maps that we show to explain risk. Some simplifications are necessary to make decisions based off of them. I also showed that the middle fork of the Nooksack River near Deming saw a greater than 100-year event. The Nooksack River, as a whole, is harder to characterize this way as it is a dynamic system where there is sediment coming off of Mount Baker, and that can alter where the flows go. Deming is towards the southeast corner of this floodplain map. When large floods occur, the main river heads west to Linden and Ferndale before heading out to Puget Sound, but some of these flows head north towards Canada in the vicinity of the city of Everson and through the city of Sumas and then Abbotsford, British Columbia. This area was hit very hard in November of 2021. Comparing this event to November 2021 at the Nooksack River at Everson, which is where this flow splits. As you can see, the flows at this location were pretty close to what was seen in 2021, just a half foot lower at the gauge. The link provided on this slide and in the chat is a video that describes the impacts seen up there in the November 2021 event for perspective. Comparing this event to some of those we have seen, one can see that in 1996 we saw a comparable, if not larger, event. As we did in 2009, and one could show this for 2003, 2006, and 2007 as well. These events are changing our understanding of flood risk in our communities, and so it is going to be important to understand what is physically happening to cause this to better understand the future. The video link I have here is one that talks about one of the possible factors that may be causing a greater frequency of atmospheric rivers hitting Washington State. In an analysis I did back in 2010 at stream gauges that have greater than 50 years of record, including from 1990 to 2010, and on the west side of the Cascades in Washington State. This evaluation did show that there's an unusual number of floods of record in western Washington since 1990, with 81% of floods of record occurring since 1990. I hope you found this discussion of the December 2025 floods in Washington interesting. I feel there is more to talk about, such as how we got to these vulnerabilities in these communities, what has been the history in trying to address these issues, and what does the future look like, but those are a conversation for a future time. For future and similar content, check out my YouTube station and website. Thank you for listening.